I never thought my life would spiral into something so complicated. My name is Jake, and I'm 24 years old. I've known Ethan, my best friend, since high school. We've been inseparable for years, sharing everything from secrets to late-night video game marathons. But there was one secret I never shared with him, my fascination with his mom, Claire. Claire was the kind of woman who turned heads without even trying. At 48, she had the kind of confidence and elegance that made her look timeless. She carried herself with grace, always well put together, and had a warmth about her that made everyone feel at ease. I spent countless weekends at Ethan's house, and every time Claire walked into the room, my eyes followed her. She'd laugh at my jokes, offer me snacks, and occasionally brush her hand against mine in ways that felt too intimate to be accidental. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just imagining things. After all, she was Ethan's mom, and that made her completely off limits. But everything changed one rainy afternoon. I had the day off work and decided to surprise Ethan with a visit. When I arrived, Claire answered the door with that same radiant smile, but Ethan wasn't home. "It's just me," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "You're welcome to wait until he gets back." As the rain poured harder outside, it became clear I wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. Claire offered me tea, and we sat in the cozy living room, talking about life. The conversation flowed easily, too easily. Her laughter lingered, her gaze held mine longer than it should have, and for the first time, I wondered if I wasn't imagining things after all. When she brushed a strand of hair from my face, my skin tingled, and something shifted between us. The air grew heavy, charged with unspoken tension. I should have walked away. I should have remembered who she was and what was at stake. But I didn't. And that's how I found myself on the edge of a decision that would change everything. The rain didn't let up. Instead, it pounded harder against the windows, trapping me inside Claire's warm, dimly lit living room. But it wasn't the storm outside that made it hard to breathe. It was her. Claire sat across from me, her legs crossed, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. I couldn't stop staring at her. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she said, her voice soft but teasing. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, but she didn't look away. Instead, she leaned in, her eyes locked on mine. "You know you can talk to me, Jake." My pulse quickened. Was this innocent? Was I reading too much into it? Or was there something real simmering beneath the surface? I tried to change the subject, but every time our eyes met, the air felt heavier, charged with tension I couldn't ignore. When Claire stood up to grab more tea, she brushed past me, her hand grazing my shoulder. The touch lingered longer than it should have, sending a jolt through my body. I told myself it was nothing, but my mind was already racing. And then it happened. As she handed me the cup, our fingers touched. Neither of us pulled away. Instead, her gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that terrified me, desire. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before I could respond, the front door creaked open. My heart stopped. "Mom!" It was Ethan. Claire stepped back so quickly it was as if nothing had happened. She turned toward the door, smoothing her hair and smiling like everything was normal. "Ethan, you're home early," she said, her voice light and cheerful. But my hands were shaking. Ethan walked in, dropping his bag by the door. "Yeah, work let out early because of the storm." "Hey, Jake. Didn't know you'd be here." I forced a smile, trying to steady my breathing. "Yeah, just stopped by to hang out." But Claire didn't look at me. Not once. The rest of the evening was torture. Claire played the perfect hostess, laughing at Ethan's jokes and acting like nothing had happened. But every time our eyes met across the room, the heat was still there, undeniable and dangerous. After Ethan went to bed, I started to leave. Claire followed me to the door. "You okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but the tension was unbearable. "I should go." She stepped closer, her hand brushing my arm. "Jake, about earlier." I froze, waiting for her to finish. But instead, she leaned in, close enough for me to feel her breath against my skin. "This can't happen," she whispered. But the way her fingers lingered on my arm told me she didn't believe her own words. And neither did I. That night, I lay awake, replaying every moment in my head. Her touch, her voice, the way she looked at me, it all felt too real to ignore. But the guilt was there too. This was Ethan's mom. My best friend's mother. I knew it was wrong. I knew crossing that line would ruin everything. But even as I tried to convince myself to walk away, I couldn't stop thinking about her. About the way her lips parted when she spoke. about the softness of her touch. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. I tried to stay away. I really did. For the next few days, I avoided Ethan's calls and ignored Claire's texts, pretending like nothing had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get her out of my head. Her touch, her voice, the way her eyes lingered on mine, it haunted me. And then she called. I shouldn't have answered, but the moment I saw her name flash across my screen, my resolve crumbled. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "Jake," she breathed. "We need to talk." I knew what I should have said. I should have told her no, told her we couldn't keep doing this. But instead, I found myself agreeing to meet her. That night, I drove back to Ethan's house. The lights were dim, and my heart raced as Claire opened the door. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, but somehow, she looked more stunning than ever. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and the scent of her perfume hit me the moment I stepped inside. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. Then she closed the door, and suddenly we were alone again. "Claire," I started, but she shook her head. "Don't," she said softly, stepping closer. "Don't say it." Her eyes locked on mine, and I felt my breath hitch. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek. "I can't stop thinking about you," she whispered. Her words broke whatever was left of my restraint. I grabbed her waist, pulling her closer as our lips met in a kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through my body. She melted into me, her hands sliding up my chest and into my hair. I couldn't get enough of her, the taste of her lips, the warmth of her body pressed against mine. We stumbled toward the couch, our movements frantic and desperate. Her sweater slipped off her shoulders, and my hands roamed over her skin, savoring every inch of her. "This is wrong," she murmured against my lips. But neither of us stopped. The rain started again, pounding against the windows as we lost ourselves in each other. Her touch ignited something in me, something I couldn't control. I wanted her, needed her, in a way that scared me. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. When we finally pulled away, breathless and tangled in each other's arms, the weight of what we had done settled over us. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered. I nodded, but even as I agreed, I knew it was a lie. I couldn't walk away. And neither could she. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We found excuses to be alone. Quick meetings while Ethan was out, late-night phone calls that turned into hours of conversation. Every touch, every kiss felt more dangerous than the last, but we couldn't stop. One night, as we lay tangled in her bed, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "What happens if he finds out?" she asked softly. I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was I didn't know. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to let her go. But the guilt was eating away at me. Every time I saw Ethan, I felt like a fraud. He had no idea what was happening behind his back. How his best friend and his mother were betraying him in the worst way possible. I told myself we'd end it. That it was just a fling, a moment of weakness. But then Claire would look at me, and all my promises would fall apart. The tension grew unbearable. I started avoiding Ethan, terrified that he'd see the truth in my eyes. Claire became more reckless too, brushing against me when Ethan was in the next room, sending me texts when she knew he could see. It was like we wanted to get caught. And then one night it almost happened. Ethan came home early. Claire and I were in the living room, our hands tangled, her lips inches from mine, when the front door creaked open. We jumped apart, my heart pounding as Ethan walked in. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked, his eyes flicking between us. "Nothing," Claire said quickly, smoothing her hair and forcing a smile. "We were just talking." Ethan's eyes narrowed. For a moment, I thought he knew. But then he shrugged and dropped his bag on the couch. I let out a shaky breath, but Claire's hand lingered on mine, hidden from Ethan's view. And in that moment, I knew. We had already gone too far. There was no turning back now. The weight of our secret grew heavier with every passing day. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, knowing one wrong step would send everything crashing down. Claire and I couldn't stay away from each other. The stolen touches, the late-night texts, the heated moments when we were sure no one was watching. It was a game we knew we couldn't win, yet we kept playing anyway. But then the night came when everything unraveled. It started out like any other evening. Ethan had invited me over to hang out, and as usual, Claire was there, calm, collected, and completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. We played video games, laughed, and drank a few beers, but my eyes kept drifting to Claire. She looked stunning in a simple sundress, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. And every time our eyes met, the heat between us threatened to burn the whole house down. After Ethan went to bed, Claire and I were left alone. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered as we stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling. But even as she said it, she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against mine. "We have to stop," she murmured, her breath warm against my skin. I didn't answer. Instead, I kissed her, hard and desperate, pushing her back against the counter. Her arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and all the guilt, the fear, the consequences melted away. Until we heard the footsteps. We froze, our eyes wide with panic. The sound of Ethan's door opening echoed through the house, and before we could react, he was standing in the doorway. His eyes darted between us, my hands gripping Claire's waist, her flushed face, the tension in the air that was impossible to hide. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "Ethan," Claire started, stepping toward him, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't," he snapped. His eyes turned to me, and the betrayal in them cut deeper than any words ever could. "You? My best friend." I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. There was nothing I could say that would make this right. "You've been sneaking around with my mom," he shouted, his voice breaking. Claire tried to step in. "Ethan, please." "No," he roared. "You're my mother. And you," he pointed at me, his hand shaking. "You were supposed to be my friend." I reached out, but he stepped back, his eyes filled with disgust. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I hesitated, but the look on his face told me there was no point in arguing. I turned and left, the sound of Claire's sobs echoing behind me. The fallout was worse than I had imagined. Ethan cut me off completely, blocking my number and refusing to answer my messages. I lost my best friend in a single moment, and no matter how many times I tried to explain, he wanted nothing to do with me. Claire wasn't any better. After that night, she called me once, to say it was over. "We can't come back from this," she said, her voice hollow. "I need to fix things with Ethan. I need to put my family first." I wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but I knew she was right. I had destroyed everything. The days turned into weeks, and the guilt weighed on me like a stone. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Everywhere I went, I saw reminders of what I had lost. I avoided Ethan's house, knowing I wasn't welcome there anymore. But one day I saw him in town. He looked right through me, like I was a stranger. And maybe that's what I had become. I thought about reaching out to Claire, but what was the point? She had made her choice, and I couldn't blame her. I tried to move on, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget her. The way she made me feel. The way her touch lingered long after she was gone. But I knew one thing for certain. No matter how much I wanted her, no matter how much I missed her, there was no going back. What we had was built on lies and betrayal, and in the end, it destroyed everything. The days after that night felt like a fog, thick, heavy, and impossible to escape. I couldn't shake the look in Ethan's eyes, the sheer betrayal that cut deeper than any words ever could. I had lost my best friend. I kept replaying the moment he caught us, the disbelief, the anger, the disgust. It haunted me. And no matter how much I told myself it wasn't supposed to happen, that it was a mistake, I couldn't erase it. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into work, but it didn't help. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was Claire. But it never was. She didn't call. She didn't text. She was gone. For weeks, I stayed away. I told myself it was for the best, that Claire needed time to fix things with Ethan. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no fixing this. Then one day, I saw her. I had stopped by the grocery store, trying to distract myself, when I spotted her in the produce aisle. My heart stopped. She looked different. Tired. Her hair was tied back, and the sparkle in her eyes was gone. But when she saw me, her breath hitched. I wanted to go to her, to say something. Anything. But before I could, she turned and walked away. I stood there, frozen, as she disappeared down the aisle. That was it. No goodbye. No closure. Just silence. The silence didn't last. About a month later, Ethan showed up at my door. I froze when I saw him, unsure of what to expect. He looked angry, but there was something else in his eyes, hurt. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside, letting him in. Neither of us spoke for a moment, the tension thick enough to choke on. "I trusted you," he said finally, his voice raw. "You were my best friend, Jake. How could you do this?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I never meant for it to happen. But it did." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know that doesn't fix it, but I am." He stared at me for a long time before finally shaking his head. "I thought I knew you," he said. "But now, I don't even recognize you." And just like that, he left. Claire called me that night. It was the first time I'd heard her voice since she ended things, and it nearly broke me. "I saw Ethan today," she said softly. "So did I replied. She hesitated, and I could hear the tears in her voice. "He's not the same. He's angry all the time. He barely talks to me." I closed my eyes, guilt washing over me. "I'm sorry, Claire. For everything." "So am I," she whispered. But it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done, and no amount of apologies could fix it. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I focused on work, started going out more, and even tried dating again. But nothing felt right. Every woman I met reminded me of Claire, her smile, her touch, the way she made me feel alive. And every time I thought I was moving on, the guilt came crashing back. I ruined everything, for Ethan, for Claire, and for myself. I thought about reaching out to her, but what was the point? She had made her choice, and I had to live with mine. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that Claire had moved away. Ethan stayed behind, but he cut ties with almost everyone, including me. I don't blame him. What I did was unforgivable. But no matter how much time passes, I can't forget Claire. The way she looked at me that night, the way her touch felt like fire on my skin, it still haunts me. And maybe it always will. Months turned into a year, but the echoes of that night never truly faded. Claire's touch, Ethan's betrayal, and the collapse of everything I once held dear lingered like shadows, refusing to let me go. I tried to convince myself that I was moving on. I filled my days with work, buried myself in hobbies, and even went on a few dates. But every smile I faked felt hollow. Every conversation reminded me of what I'd lost. I avoided Ethan's part of town completely, not because I feared running into him, but because I couldn't face what I'd done. Seeing him would only remind me of the trust I'd shattered and the friendship I'd destroyed. Claire haunted me too, though in a different way. I thought about her more than I cared to admit, the softness of her voice, the way her lips lingered just a moment longer than they should have. I hated myself for it, but there was a part of me that still missed her. And yet, no matter how much I tried to justify it, I knew what we'd done was wrong. I let temptation and desire blind me, and in the process I broke not one heart but two, Ethan's and my own. The guilt was suffocating, but it taught me something important. I learned that love, real love, doesn't come from stolen moments and whispered lies. It doesn't grow in the shadows of betrayal or thrive in secrecy. Real love is built on trust, respect, and honesty, the very things I'd thrown away. I spent months asking myself if I was a bad person. If what Claire and I shared, even for a brief moment, was worth the destruction it caused. The answer was no. It wasn't worth it. What I felt for her may have been intense, but it wasn't love. It was infatuation, a craving for something forbidden, and it cost me more than I was prepared to lose. I made peace with the fact that I'd never get closure, not from Ethan, not from Claire. And maybe I didn't deserve it. Instead, I focused on becoming someone I could respect again. I learned to set boundaries, to recognize red flags, and most importantly, to value the relationships in my life that were built on trust. I moved out of town eventually. It wasn't to run away, but to start over. I needed a clean slate, a chance to leave behind the mistakes of my past and rebuild the person I wanted to be. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I know now that what happened with Claire wasn't love. It was a moment of weakness, one that taught me some of the hardest lessons I've ever had to learn. Love isn't about passion that burns too fast or secrets that can never be shared. Love is about patience, sacrifice, and knowing that no amount of desire is worth losing the people who truly matter. I'll always carry the scars of that chapter in my life, but I refuse to let them define me. I'm stronger now, wiser. And though I may never find the words to make things right with Ethan, I've learned to forgive myself. And sometimes that's the hardest part. What would you have done if you were in my position? Could you forgive a betrayal like this, or is trust broken forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your opinions. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking and emotional stories like this one. Trust me, the next one will leave you speechless.